Oh, good to be with you on this new class on Genesis. It'll be fun to share with all of you. And pull up the usual here and PowerPoint, and we'll talk a little. So today I just figured we'd do at least an introduction. We need a little bit of time to talk about what on earth we're going to do, right? So first up, just the intro, the name, right? Let's start with the name first. Genesis is a Greek word, genesis, which means origin or beginning, right? Does anybody know the name and what the Jews call Genesis? They don't call it Genesis. That's the first guess.
No idea.
It's Bereshit, which is really just the first word is Bereshit in Hebrew, which means in the beginning. So if you were to ask a Jew about the first, they know Genesis. They're in the world and part of this as well. But in the Jewish tradition, they would call it Bereshit, the beginning.
Never heard that word.
There you go.
No,
The snarkier folks in the world will say it's sort of like the old joke, does a bear poop in the woods? Well, I don't know about that, but it's the first word in the Bible. Bereshit. So,
Slow on uptake there. Okay.
Took me a minute.
yep. Yeah. Anyway. All right, so we got to start with the obvious. It's written in Hebrew and has been a source of faith and inspiration for some 3,000 to 4,000 years, depending on the exact dating. That's always up in the air a little bit for when it went from an oral tradition into a written tradition. Considering what we know about it, most likely it was written down in the first temple period, or even in the monarchy period kind of frame there. And so we know that it was probably about that 3,000, at least 3,000, but probably existed in various forms before that for another 500 to 1,000 years before. So it's an old book, or really it's an old library, right? It's a collection of individual stories that have been put together. And we as Christians obviously read it pretty differently than our Jewish sisters and brothers, often vastly so. And what tends to happen is is the sort of Christological approach. That is, we read it and think about Jesus or the Trinity, when neither idea is vaguely in the text or written with that in mind. The classic for that is with the beginning of Genesis, right? In the beginning, God hovered over the waters. The Spirit of God hovers over the waters. And there's a couple of times where God is referred to in the third person plural, right? The we, what will we do here? And it's that kind of, as Christians, we immediately go, oh, see, that means there's three of them. It's the Trinity. And no self-respecting Jew in the world would ever say that, right? They would always just say, no, there's one God and God alone. And it's just that sort of way that a king and queen refers to themselves in the plural, we, not in a regal announcement, not a divergent personality announcement sort. So my goal is to look at the text and engage with both the Christian view and the Jewish view as much as possible. Especially some of these early texts, we really have huge differences in how we view them. I can say also, I'm not a trained rabbi and I don't know their full system. So while I can give you some information, if we have a really tough question, I'll call Ron or Brad and ask them what the heck's going on here, at least from their tradition's view, right? And the last part of that is just to say, hey, we're going to have a joint Bible study in the fall with Ron and Temple Sinai. They're going to, we're calling it the Home and Home series for the most part. It'll be 4 weeks looking at the shared texts that we interpret radically differently, right? So the first week we'll look at the fall, as we would call it as Christians, right? We look at the binding of Isaac, which that's the Jewish name. We would call it the sacrifice of Isaac, right? Which gives you an idea of how we view it differently there. Passover, and then looking at the suffering servant in Isaiah. We look at those all completely differently, even though we have exactly the same set of words in front of us, right? And to sort of talk about how are our faiths connected? How can we grow deeper in understanding each other, but also then how do we see the differences, right? Where do we take a slightly different stance, and how does that then impact what we believe? So it'll be a great series. Ron and I are having fun putting it together. But that's sort of an ad for the future. For this, I'll try and do as much as I can with that, just in our conversations, to say, well, here's the way when we look at it. Obviously, the Jews are not going to have a conversation about is Jesus in the burning bush, right? But it has been like in the burning bush kind of moment. That's one of those that Christian tradition actually holds often, that it's Mary in the burning bush. I don't know how the heck she gets there, but there's all kinds of crazy things like that that get put into Jewish texts that are very clearly not what the text is saying, right? So I want to try and peel away some of that stuff to look at what's actually said versus what we think said. Like I said, it's a book that's developed over hundreds or even thousands of years. So we have multiple stories told twice, or very similar lines repeated in nuanced ways, right? There's 2 creation stories, right? There's multiple stories of the world after different points, and what happens and how it happens. Pretty obviously, then we have multiple sources that are coming in and that have been edited and interwoven together. Not something to get worried about, but it's just name it, right? And
4 of them, right?
it's called the documentary theory, right? This is what I'm sure our EFM folks will talk about. This is how it looks. There's 3 traditions generally believed to be in Genesis. Well, the Deuteronomic is the 4th, but it's not actually in Genesis. They don't think that Genesis got rewritten as much as Deuteronomy and some of the later texts. Yeah, so there are 4 that are listed. I just edited out the Deuteronomy text because they aren't sure that that's not as present or readily available in Genesis. But one, the Yahwist, is characterized by the use of the name of God, Yahweh, and this source focuses on Judah and a very anthropomorphic God, right? Like that text is the classic for that is when God shows up in the Garden of Eden and he's walking in the evening breeze, right? Like you have this image of an actual physical being walking through the Garden of Eden looking for Adam and Eve. He even seems to be a little limited in his ability because of that, right? Like who told you were naked? Why are you hiding from me? What's going on? All these kinds of questions like that. God is not omnipotent in the Yahwist version. The Elohist comes from the use of Elohim, which or El, both of which just mean God. It's the generic term for God. Interestingly enough, Elohim is actually the plural, so it technically means gods, but it's also the proper name for God. That gets confusing. It is. It sort of overlaps there in the Hebrew, and they don't worry about it at all in Judaism. But as a Christian, when you're trying to translate, sometimes it's a weird hiccup in the PDF where you're like, I think that's just God when they said Elohim there, but it may be otherwise. Again, most of the time it is El in the text, which is why you have people like Mikael, you can always tell that's man of God, right? Or Elizabeth, she's a woman of God, right? Like when you ever see an El within a larger name, Bethel is the house of God, Beit El is what it would be in Hebrew. Anytime you see an El in a Hebrew related name, it's going to have a relationship then to God, right? But again, that focuses more on the Northern Kingdom. So they think that some of that text might well have been written by the Northern Kingdom scribes and groups trying to justify why the Northern Kingdom was really important versus the Yahwist being about Judah. And it's a much more abstract God. This is the God that we know. If we talk about Christianity in a lot of ways, when we talk about God the Father, we are often in the Elohist camp. That when we sort of talk about God as this abstract figure who creates the heaven and the earth and is sort of just present, but not physically there. While on the other hand, if you're going, hey, I always like to think of Michelangelo's creation, right? And there is the old man with the white beard, then you're in the Yahwist camp for that idea, if that makes sense, right? Between those two different ways of viewing God. Then finally, there's the priestly account, which is characterized by priests, right? They focus on the priests and why worship is important, and shrines and genealogies and connections, and why you need clergy to do all these important things. Okay, I've really stripped it down a lot because they are much more detailed when you talk theories individually and how these different sources work.
These are much more accessible definitions than Collins ever gave us in EFM. I'll tell you that.
Yes. Well, and I was trying to make them a little more accessible. But Collins is also right; they're more complex than this.
Well, yeah.
Right.
Collins makes his living making things complex.
Yes. Any questions about those three strains? Again, it's a broad, super easy kind of characterization. It's my favorite trivia as well to say that the Elohist text, Elohim is that term for God, which then there are, as we talk about superheroes, there is a superhero that shares that name. Does anybody know who we're talking about? Two Jewish boys created him. Kal-El, the name for Superman. He is the present God. So when Simon and when those guys created Superman, they literally were going like, we want a current God who can help us out as Jews and get us out of tough spots. So there you go. There's your random pop trivia of the day. But that's why his father is Jor-El. He is Kal-El. They are the house of El, or the house of gods.
Who knew that? My goodness. That's
Bill
good
Murray.
trivia.
I just found out, I always knew Superman was my hero, but now I know why.
Yep. There you go. All right. So this theory is also now, they will say it's a totally 20th century theory, that scholars now see these as much more blended. And what they've nuanced it in the 20th century, they pretty much said there's the Elohist, the Yahwist, the priestly, and then the Deuteronomic, there we go, sources, and that they're all woven through the text, and they all edit each other and change each other and influence each other, right? And they'll try and pull exact threads out. Now, they have nuanced this theory a good deal to say that they believe that the Elohist and Yahwist sort of appeared about the same time and were written roughly the same time and automatically woven together. And that then the priestly account came in and edited a whole bunch of things. The priests got a hold of it and said, wait a second, there's nothing about priests. We need more information here to make sure there's a role for the clergy in the world. That's more of the 21st century spin on this, while the Deuteronomic is then a group that came after the priestly source and edited again on top of the first 2/3. It's all a theory, so that's the trick with all of this, right? Like they're guessing about how this was written, looking at what's written, and it's always a little bit difficult to tell what's going on. So here's the real question: what does it mean for us if we're going to talk about those guys, these 4 different sources? We can talk about sources. It's called source criticism. We can talk about edits, but I prefer what's called the canonical technique. That is, it doesn't ignore any of this information, but rightly says, well, this is the book we have. What do we do with this book, right? The canonical is a relatively new process where they just say, it's great to know source criticism and form criticism and literary criticism and womanist and feminist and all the rest. But at the end of the day, we don't get to wish away the hard verses, and we don't get to skip over the easy verses. We have to look at all of it, right? And it all is in tension with what tradition says. And I've gotten more and more on that canon technique, because a lot of times you take this apart to such a degree, you got nothing but pieces in the floor, and you're going, what do I know now? Right? You end up with nothing but a sort of broken machine. So what will happen is the creation story one creation story in particularly, I think will help show how that works. We'll look at some of those as we go, right? But I think the more helpful way to view Genesis as a whole is two parts, just broadly. Part one is prehistory or the primeval history, chapters 1 through 11. This is the antediluvian period, right? Like this is all before the flood and Babel and all those kinds of stories. This is the stuff that happens. Basically, it's everything pre-Abraham. Once Abraham shows up, then you actually end up in the section, which is the ancestor history, right? The ancestral history, which is the balance of the book, chapters 12 through 52. And even then, we'll look at both and examine both, but that's probably the more helpful way. I think when you get into some of the source criticism, like with that, those, is this Yahwist? Is this Elohist? Well, it can help a little, but at the end of the day, you've also just got to figure out what to do with that text, regardless of who wrote it or when. So it was also, we have to name, the book was written as the ancient world was telling lots and lots of stories, right? So we'll look at the similarities and differences between some of those. The classic that I'm sure you all have heard is the Gilgamesh story about a guy in Mesopotamia who builds a boat and saves his people from floods. Sounds a lot like Noah, right? So we'll talk about some of those overlaps. If you ever want to go a deep dive on that, there's a book called Old Testament Parallels, and we'll use the book, but it's actually mildly terrifying sometimes. If you really just sit down and look at that book, almost every line of Genesis has an antecedent somewhere in one of the creation stories of the ancient Near East, right? And Israel was right there in that major crossroads, right? So they had Babylonians going down to Egypt, Egyptians coming up to Syria, Syria going over to the Assyrians. I mean, you had these people marching all over each other, sharing those stories. You can get upset by it, or you can realize that that's how the book was understood and written, right? As they told their stories, it was not so much about, oh, let's tell the story of Gilgamesh. It was, how do we tell that story in relation to God? Which is a little bit different, if that makes sense. It's what's the meaning of it, right? The other side is to look at Midrash. Midrash or Midrashim is a Jewish tradition of telling stories to complete stories, right? So there can be, and this happens throughout the text, there can be like one line that doesn't make a lot of sense in the Jewish text, right? And translated into the Christian text, right? Into English. And it'll just be one line that you sort of go, what's that about, right? One of the classic ways of looking at that is just sort of looking through it. The first is just the Book of Legends is the book I'll be using. Woo, there it is. The Sefer Haggadah, rather. It's just the book of stories, legends, and it literally goes almost line by line through just the Pentateuch, and it's about 1,000 pages long and a giant book on top of it, with all sorts of stories. And it's basically like, well, this rabbi was wondering why God was hovering over the waters. Does that mean someone created the waters before God was there? Or then they go, no, what it means is this, and they tell a whole story for how the waters got there in the first place, right? And lots of the stories in there don't get any real credit, but then there are other stories, like why Abraham was favored by God. There's a classic story about him smashing other idols. And that story, most Jews hear it so often, believe that story to be in the Bible. It's heard so often, not realizing that it's a midrash instead, a story told to explain the Bible. But we'll look at some of those, partly because they're just fun too. It helps open up the book and story in wonderful ways. I'll give you a great example of this, of collections of sources and how this all sort of piles on top of each other before we even get into the book, right? So it's the creation story. Rabbis noticed early on that we have not one, but two stories of creation, right? You have on the first day, second day, third day, fourth day, right? It has the 7 days of creation that things happen. Then you have a second creation that's really about how Adam is created, then a rib is removed to create a woman, right? That's the whole kind of, like, there's two stories, and the rabbis realized that early on, so they started to tell stories to understand that. As a result, Jewish tradition then has Adam had a first wife, and her name was Lilith, right? in the Jewish tradition, and even some of the Christian traditions. Sometimes you'll hear that even mentioned in Christian sources. And that's directly as a result of the rabbis saying, wait, there's a woman who's created on the sixth day of creation, and she is declared good. Men and women are created on the same day. Then the second story, here comes Adam, and then they take a rib out, and then Eve is created. So what the heck happened to that first woman? Is it the same woman? Are they just telling different stories? The same story? They had to wrestle with that. And so the creation was then, oh, there were two women and Adam had two wives. The first was Lilith. And Lilith shows up in what's called the alphabet of Ben Sarah as Adam's first wife. This is about the 10th century. And that's when she's fully named as Adam's first wife, right? The sort of first Eve. She refuses to serve Adam, to be subservient Adam. And then she refuses to stay in the garden because she falls in love and sleeps with the archangel Samael. Yeah, this isn't a story that's anywhere in scripture, but these are the sort of stories that get told on top of the stories. So Lilith is this person who sort of peels off from all of the narrative, right? It's sort of Adam being left alone, and that's why he's then sad in the second book and lonely because Lilith left him and he needs to find someone else.
Do you think the writer of Fraser knew that?
I don't know. The writer of what?
Fraser.
Oh,
His first
Fraser.
wife was Lilith too.
Yes, that's true. I don't know. They might have. I do
There's
know.
a parallel there. I hadn't thought about it.
Well, there was a series of concerts back in the 90s and aughts called the Lilith Fair, and they did intentionally take the name from Lilith because it was supposed to be about women who did not submit to men. They wanted that to be their icon
Oh, wow.
of music, right? Lilith is our icon. She's the woman who refused to submit to Adam and throw off the patriarchy. So Lilith shows up. She still shows up a good deal here or there and in between, right?
She just doesn't get much airtime in the Revised Common Lectionary.
No, she gets no time in the Revised Common Lectionary. So before that, though, before the 10th century, she was a demon succubus from the mythology of the Sumerians, Assyrians, Akkadians, and Babylonians, right? She was this evil female demon that always tried to tempt men to their doom. That's all part of those stories and their myths and mythology, right? So you have, but they're all literally, that's on all, Israel was surrounded by those folks. So they likely heard all of those stories in the same way that even now we hear the stories of Thor and the Norwegian gods, right? Or the Greek gods. We know all these other stories that sort of carry on top of us, and we hear those stories around us. Same way here, and Israel is pretty commonly retold stories, as has Christianity, retold stories and made them our own, right? Tweak them in little ways here, there, and in between. So Lilith, though, biblically only shows up in Isaiah 34, and it's a random mention that we don't know what the heck it's there for. Right? There's just this one line that says Lilith will be afraid. And you're like, what? What is that about? Most scholars think that this was related to the night demon from Babylonian mythology, and that, of course, Isaiah was written during the Babylonian captivity, so it makes sense that they would make a reference there or have some conversation there. But it's all, this is where all the layers get built up for one little line or two in Genesis, right? When you have a 3,000 or 4,000 year old book, this is the kind of stuff that can happen with that one line of text, right? You have Midrash, you have neighboring mythologies, you have stories on top of stories, and then you have this whole created side account that's supposed to help us inform and understand the original account. Does anybody know why Lilith would run off with an angel? Nope. Then does
Who
anybody?
wouldn't?
Who wouldn't?
Who wouldn't?
Yes, ma'am. On one level. Does anybody remember the reason for the first flood? Not the first flood, the only flood for the flood of Noah?
No.
God was mad. God was not happy with humankind.
God was
Right.
not happy because angels and women would lie together, and they had a race of giants and superheroes.
Yes, I remember.
Okay.
They were called the Nephilim. And so part of the story then of Lilith is connecting to what is a biblical account. God is mad because humanity is sinful, but they're sinful, not just for killing each other, but also because the angels haven't been acting real good either, and they've been all intermarrying and creating all kinds of trouble.
With some sexy angels. Oh my God.
Yeah.
I'm telling you. You know, I never thought of it, but it must be really nice to be able to blame angels for everything. I like
Yeah.
that. I really The angels did it. Got it.
It's all the angels' fault.
Yeah, they used to say the devil made you
That's
do it.
it,
Now it's
that's
the
it.
angels did. Oh.
All my life, I've been looking for the answer and I found it. Wonderful.
I'm glad I could help you out, you know.
You were
Oh,
tempted by an
thank you,
angel.
Bill. I do appreciate that. Okay? So it was the angels all the time.
I didn't know that's where
I'm
the
sorry.
Nephilim came from.
Yeah, the Nephilim are listed
The Nephilim are the offspring of women and angels?
that's
Yes.
the
Huh.
tradition.
Who knew?
There you go. Well, we don't
Well,
talk about
obviously-
it much, but it's all caught up in that. Yeah.
It won't be too long. We'll get there. Okay.
It doesn't
it's
take
early
too
on.
long.
Doesn't
It's a-
take
it's a-
too long for us. But it's kind of funny. It's only a verse, I think, or maybe two, and that's gone. That's it. That's the only, boof.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Sure,
which is
yeah.
why, and it's such a weird verse of like there were giants called the Nephilim, and you're like, what?
It
what is
doesn't-
going on?
It's
Yeah.
like what? It's like the chapter 13 or whatever it is in Mark. Where'd it come from? What? Yeah. This just kind of pops in and then disappears again. So
Well, and we have the fascinating thing is the Nephilim show up. God gets mad. He wipes out the earth, but then they keep finding artifacts from the Nephilim throughout the Old Testament at different points. They'll find giant beds that are 10 feet long that were part, the giants' beds and stuff like that. And you're like, wait, how did this last? Where did that come up?
And then there's that whole thing in there in Joshua about there are giants in the land.
Right? They're very worried
When they-
about,
Scouting out Canaan.
yep, they're very worried when they come back to the promised land that there are giants there. Yeah. So again, these are those stories that all are on top of each other, and all the myth and legend that gets floated through, and you hear them all on top of each other, which is fascinating.
in here, I thought the Giants were a baseball or a football team. Oh well.
So there you go. Again, this is the sort of the stuff that partly I also love because it's fascinating to sort of hear the stories and how they get woven between different parts of other stories, and how it doesn't, while it is just one line about the Nephilim, they keep echoing through scripture in ways that you go like, what is up with giants and the fear of giants? And we're still telling them Jack and the Beanstalk and every other kind of story about giants, right? Like it's not something in the human psyche says that we used to have giants or we want there to be giants, or people are scary so we make them bigger than they are, metaphorically, right? There's all those kinds of things on top of each other. All right, so we won't go that deep on every single line because we would literally, I don't know, we get through one chapter at a time, one chapter in a year if we were to go through every line of verse. But if I'm happy to take those detours because Genesis has an amazing amount of information that does matter for the rest of the text and how we understand the rest of our faith, but we don't always go deep, right, with it. So we do have time to look at our faith and how it works with all of this, right? So if there's something you hear and you go, hey, let's go back and look at that a little bit more, we can do that any week to week kind of fun. But again, the process then is more important to me than the sources. That is the book that we have, what we've received, and then how are we going to look at it? Which then is this. I don't focus a whole lot on the source method because it's always changing, but I'm more concerned about how the book, a little bit about how the book was written. That is, what was the purpose? What were they trying to do with the book, right? That canonical method. And what we have is an ancient text that was written to inspire our faith in God and to help us understand the world and how it got here, right? That's the whole purpose of the text. You can ask the rabbis, you can ask scholars, everyone's agreed that's why they wrote it, right? Was to explain the promise of God's people for that ancestral side of it, like how did that happen and the covenants that are made. And then on the other side, that primeval is to explain, well, what is this world about? What does it mean? So I don't have the belief that this is an exacting historical record. So I don't think of it in that terms of this is what literally happened at every given moment. I think that's a different way of looking at it. What's that?
I said, thank you.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's important, and I do think it's important to say that Abraham was a person. I do believe that. But did 3 angels visit him under the oaks of Mamre? Maybe they were just visitors who were angel-like, right? Or who brought good news. And so, angel just means messenger. It can be that, right? There's lots of ways to engage the text that don't have to be that literal, exacting understanding. It reminds me of a quote, one of my favorite ones from John Dominic Crossan, who said, "My point, once again, is not that those ancient people told literal stories and we are now smart enough to take them symbolically, but that they told them symbolically and we are now dumb enough to take them literally." Right? We have this weird tendency with in our scientific age to think, oh, this is an exact story of exactly what happened. That's how we tell our stories now, but historically they had no problem telling a story that included angels. And if you really press them, they go, well, I don't know if there was an angel there, but this person was important, so we put an angel in the story to say that it was important, right? They would have no problem with that sort of mixing of fact and fiction, or fact and fiction, to create a more symbolic story that has more importance than just the simple story, right? And we've done that historically. The classic being like, the cherry tree and George Washington, right? He probably didn't cut down a cherry tree, and he probably did not say, I cannot tell a lie, or any of that kind of stuff. But the reason we tell those stories is to say George Washington was important, and here's why he's important, and here's this apocryphal story that helps us understand what an honest and good man he was, right? Every faith and every nation does those similar stories, right? About their leaders, about their faith, about their country. We have it on multiple levels. It's just that for some reason, when we start talking faith, we start acting like it needs to be much more than that sort of conversation about conveying meaning. It becomes this, well, I need to go find the literal record as well as the archaeological record to prove that it's fact, and find, like go down these lines of all this other stuff. When, let's be honest, whoever wrote Genesis, whether it was Moses, probably not, or anyone else, whoever was putting that text together or edited that text, was doing all they could to try and explain who they understand God to be, and who the community understands God to be, right? And that informs who we are.
Bill, one of the interesting things in a couple of chapters in the 3,000 years of Christian history, it talked about how as the Protestants developed, they were the ones that took the Bible more literally.
Okay. Interesting.
Because as Protestant developed in the United States and all, but they had a tendency to take the Bible literally, whereas in Orthodoxy, they did not. They understood the concepts of metaphors and that it was symbolic.
Yeah, absolutely. And that symbolism, like all symbols, right, points to a greater information, knowledge, or resource than necessarily looking for that literal answer to everything. Yep. And I have heard literalism called the modern, our modern heresy, right? To read some of these things literally is a heretical way to view some of it, because it strips any meaning out of it. So that's another way of viewing some of that. I don't know if I would go all the way that way for some of them, but there's certainly some stories, if you read it so literally, like if you read, for instance, Easter, right? If you read Easter as nothing but a literal story of what happened, then Easter shouldn't have meaning for any of us, because that only happened to Jesus once upon a time, the end, right? If you don't understand that, at least on some level, as wait, Easter is a pattern of life that God enacts in the world, and it means something to us, and this is symbolic of as well as literal, right? It can be Jesus literally rose from the dead, which I believe, and it can be a metaphorical way of understanding how God works in the world, that death is not the final answer, that there is more to life, that there is lots of ways of viewing things than just allowing death to be the end of something. Yeah, anyway. All right, so the questions, I think there's sort of 3 questions we should look at each time we're reading these texts, regardless of what we go, sort of whatever paths we go down, that I think they would ultimately be said in that sort of symbolic way, like, how does this inform my faith, right? What does this story, how does it work on me and on what I understand, who I understand God to be? And again, what is the storyteller teaching about God and or humanity? Those are the bigger, that's what I do feel confident in saying, whoever put the text together, wrote it, edited it, and then edited it again, most likely, I think they were all telling stories because they were trying to make faith of the world and of God the same way that we do all the time now, right? Like, why did God allow 9/11 to happen? And we spend lots of time talking about, what does it mean? And was America to blame, or were the hijackers to blame? And does it war between Islam and the West? Is it like all those kinds of things? We will willingly have that conversation about 9/11, but for some reason we get nervous about it with Holy Writ, when that's the whole point of Scripture, is literally, how do we understand ourselves and God, and what is it teaching us about all of this, right? Symbolically, metaphorically, in lots of different ways. Whoa, I lost everybody. And then, yeah, where is God in the text is the last one, is that last question, which is different than teaching about God. Sometimes we have to say, where was God in the book? What did we understand God to be saying? And is God in the story? Because there are times when God technically isn't even in the room, but God's always in the room, right? Especially, how does God influence the decisions that are made, the conversations that are happening, all that work. Thoughts, questions, comments. That's how I want to approach it. We can, if we want to tweak it, what else do you want to hear or learn as we go through?
I love all of these stories that you're telling, or explanations. To me, that's just so fascinating. It makes it so much more rich.
Good. Yeah, I mean, I want to try and put some layers on there without going to a point where we drown.
Yeah.
We can drown in information easily in Genesis.
Yes, we can.
Probably for me, one of the books that I'll be using, just for my prep, it's the gold standard in my opinion anyway, is the Walter Brueggemann Genesis interpretation. I love Brueggemann, period. He's a great writer and thinker, but that's the one that I'll be most likely engaging with, and it's written.
And the name of that book again, and who is the author?
Walter Brueggemann.
Brueggemann, okay.
Brueggemann,
Two G's, right?
Mann. Huh? 2 G's, 2 N's. Yeah. Brueggemann was a professor at Candler. He's in town. We could get him to come talk to us sometime here. Sure. And he's a brilliant teacher.
He's been to Holy Innocents, Bill.
Oh, good.
I got him. Yeah.
We'll have to get him to come again and preach.
Let's get him back.
He's so good. And that particular commentary, the whole interpretation commentary, is good because it's not. The whole idea is, how do you get ready to teach and preach about the book versus here's every single word and let's analyze every single turn of phrase, right? He's much more like, what are the themes? What are the meaning? What are we doing with this text? Than necessarily, like I said, just trying to say, well, the third word on page 17 is translated this way, and then you go down these little rabbit holes that exhaust you. So, yeah, I'll use that. I'll use the Midrash from the Jewish tradition, and look at the source book as well. Look at those sort of legends in the world. Partly because the classic for me is the Gilgamesh story, right? Like people will always go, oh, well, the Jews took the Gilgamesh story and made it about a guy named Noah instead of Gilgamesh, right? And I go, well, then you missed the whole point of the Noah story, which is not that Noah saved the people, right? He saved these animals, he put them on the boat, he saved his family and helped restart the world. That's how we tell our story, right? Well, Gilgamesh is much more a warrior who sort of saves some people and then gets off the boat, kills people and conquers a nation and takes over some stuff. And you're like, but there's no God present in that story, right? It's not God's providence that teaches Noah how to get through the bad times. It's all about just the ingenuity of Gilgamesh. So it's saying something about how humans need God to get through the bad times. It's saying something about God might well have caused the flood, but also had enough compassion and love that he wanted to save people from the flood, right? I mean, there's all those levels that you start going, oh, then it does matter how we retold the story, how Jews have chosen to tell that story versus how the Gilgamesh parables and stories get listed, right? When you compare some of those tales, you start to go, oh yeah, that's what they're trying to say about God or about humanity or both.
Well,
So.
Isn't that what Genesis is, though, right? Genesis is the story about God.
Yeah. Well, it's the first book, right? It's introducing us to God, period. Who the heck is this guy?
There you go. Yep. The story of stories. I guess I should say it's the stories of, there you go.
Yeah, the stories, all kinds of collected stories about God.
And my favorite story is how Genesis ends. I can't wait till we get there.
You may be waiting a while. It may be a year.
I realize that, which is okay. It makes it worthwhile because I know what's coming. Okay, so there you go.
Yep, absolutely.
It'll be worth the wait.
Absolutely. Betty, what else we need to talk about? You're the guru.
But before we get to Noah, I would recommend that everybody get a copy of Peter Spear's book. Do you know that children's book, Bill?
No, I don't.
It's by a guy named Peter Spears, and it's probably one of my favorite books for children in the whole world. It's for everybody. It is so marvelous. There are very few words in it, but it is pictures, just lovely, whimsical pictures of the creatures on the ark. I strongly recommend it.
Oh, are you talking about the one that has no words?
Yeah.
Yeah, I do have that. I take that back.
When Noah counts off the days.
Yes.
And at the end, there's all that excrement.
Yep. Yep.
It's just so lovely, but it's so human too.
Right. Yeah. It's for those who haven't seen it, literally there's no words in it. It's just these amazing pictures and drawings. And you just you see the story clearly, but you don't have that actual written word to influence you one way or another. You just sort of see the animals and the chaos and the flood and everything in between. Yeah. Yeah. We'll get there soon. That won't take long. I will say this, everything in that sort of primeval period is much heavier sledding because you have to spend a good deal more time talking about what does this mean and how does it work, versus when you actually get into the patriarchs, right? When you start getting into Abraham, then you have stories where you can almost read a whole chapter and have a few comments because they're just a story, right? It's a story about how Abraham leaves his homeland and goes to a new place, and it's a whole different way of engaging. So imagine those first 11 chapters will take a good deal of weeks to get through. I have a meeting next week, so we'll be off next week, but then the following week we'll jump right in with Genesis, and in the beginning was the Tohu Vabohu, as it's called, the Tohu Vabohu, the wild and waste of the world. So it'll be fun to look at. And I know the other thing I'll look at is, has anybody ever seen the Shocking Bible? Heard of that translation? it's a wonderful translation that most people believe is one of the closest, and they just do a wonderful job with it. It's just for hold on, let me grab it off the wall here. The 5 Books of Moses by Everett Fox. But I've used that for a number of different things. It's a beautifully done book that gives you just line by line translation straight from the Hebrew with all sorts of notation about what's going on. And so I'll use that text a good deal as well, just because it's beautifully done. And it's a great way to help you look at the text. It's sort of like the Message to a certain degree of here's all the info, but also here's a little bit of the meaning. The Message, of course, is more of a paraphrase. This is more a little bit, this is a much more literal, but the sort of classic knowing that that as we get to that sort of literal phase, that we need to understand, like in English, the woman we have the word for woman and man that have a connotation, but in Hebrew, it's even closer. Man is ish and woman is isha, right? Like it just has an A ending. And so it's literally the same word with just a feminine ending. And so like instead of calling them like she will be called woman, he goes, she'll be called woman isha, and from man ish she was taken, right? So you get that feeling of, oh yeah, there it is, even in the words, right, is how those are connected.
What about human?
What's that?
What about simply human?
Well, in that case, that's the whole story about making them male and female. So they're using those terms, but yeah. And we'll talk about language. I mean, the language is tricky for all of this, right? I mean, I have no problem using female pronouns for God, or male pronouns for God, or plural pronouns for God, right? That they, them pronouns, knowing that all fall short of the fullness of God, right? For me, that's the bigger thing. When people sort of go, we need to call God woman, I'm like, well, that's just replacing pronouns. That doesn't help anything.
Exactly.
All we're doing is fighting over like sort of our limited view. The bigger
Exactly.
question is understanding God in totality, which is beyond and more than male or female, right? So
Madeline L'Engle uses L as a pronoun, which the Jews would probably frown on, but it's a thought.
sure, yeah, absolutely.
Surpasses all understanding.
Amen. Amen. Yeah, the closest anyone got was Moses, and he only saw God's backside, right? That was the closest anyone's gotten. So,
Or his voice, right?
he did hear his voice and was
Hear
in
his
his
voice.
presence enough to glow. So,
I mean, this has been a great morning, but you do have to change the prayer question, right? Right, Bill?
yeah.
Most merciful God, we confess that the angel did it.
The angels did it, yes. I love it. I love it.
I do
All right.
too.
Good stuff, my friends. Well, we will see you in a couple of weeks, and have a great day. Hope to see you Sunday.
Okay.
Bye.
Hey,
Thanks.
Bill.
Take care, y'all.
Take care, everybody. Have a wonderful
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.